These limitations that you hear about mean only that you can't go on with the same design, but it doesn't mean that it's not possible in principle. And therefore, I have considered the question, let's make it a different way, make computers a different way, with atoms, with interactions, with certain kinds of connections. How small can it be made? Can it be made so that each one atom, in the state of one atom, tells you yes or no instead of gold and silver? And the answer is, of course, that the laws of physics that you have to use are very different than the laws here. They're called quantum mechanical laws. The scale is so small. We have to worry about the uncertainty principle and everything else. But just let me tell you that it turns out to be possible.
The term quantum simulations, we actually credit Richard Feynman with, to have defined it about 30 years ago in a famous lecture that he gave on the physics of computation. And he summed up the motivation of why we would want to have something like this nicely in the end of that talk in the following way. He said, nature isn't classical, damn it, and if you want to make a simulation of nature, you'd better make it quantum mechanical, and by golly, it's a wonderful problem because it doesn't look easy.
So the title of this talk is Quantum Life. It's about how quantum mechanics plays an unexpectedly important role in living systems. It was thought until quite recently that the kind of quantum weirdness, which plays an important role in things like quantum computing, which is my own field, played very little role in actual living systems. Then, about 3.5 years ago, a very beautiful experiment done by the Fleming group, Graham Fleming's group in Berkeley, showed that quantum mechanics and quantum coherence and quantum entanglement and wacky stuff like that was playing a very important role in photosynthesis.
And then the next level, which is maybe the most tantalizing, is where quantum mechanics becomes a functional necessity. Some potential examples from this class, the way geckos hold on to things is maybe through van der Waals forces, magnetoreception in birds, olfaction.
Quantum mechanics is playing some funky role is in the sense of smell.
If we smell molecular vibrations, we must have a spectroscope in our nose. Now this is a spectroscope, okay, on my laboratory bench. And it's fair to say that if you look up somebody's nose, you're unlikely to see anything resembling this. Bob Jaklovich and John Lamb at Ford Motor Company, in the days when Ford Motor was spending vast amounts of money on fundamental research, discovered a way to build a spectroscope that was intrinsically nanoscale. In other words, no mirrors, no lasers, no prisms, no nonsense, just a tiny device. And they built this device. Here's how it works. Electrons are fuzzy creatures, and they can jump across gaps, but only at equal energy. If the energy differs, they can't jump. Unlike us, they won't fall off the cliff. Okay. Now, if something absorbs the energy, the electron can travel. Okay? So they asked us to make a new coumarin. And so we started doing calculations. And the first thing you do is you calculate the vibrational spectrum of coumarin, and you smooth it out so that you have a nice picture of what this sort of chord, so to speak, of coumarin is. And then you start cranking the computer to find other molecules, related or unrelated, that have the same vibrations. That compound, bottom right, which is related to coumarin but has an extra pentagon inserted into the molecule. Calculate the vibrations. The purple spectrum is that new fella. The white one is the old one. And prediction is it should smell of coumarin. They made it, and it smelled exactly like coumarin.
And all of these things in quantum and life, when quantum living systems are using quantum mechanics, they're basically using it for what all living systems use stuff for, which is to have more sex. I call this quantum hanky-panky. And in fact, these bacteria that I'm going to talk about are sulfur-breathing bacteria that live on the bottom of the ocean in hot water vents, where a photon comes by only about every half hour or so. So you can see the strong evolutionary pressure towards efficiency in these bacteria, because here's the bacteria. Bacteria is like, I caught a photon. Thank God that finally the children will eat. Oh shoot, I dropped it. Oh no. Oh, you idiot. Oh, the children, you dropped the photon. The children will starve, right? So, simply for spousal relations amongst bacteria, it's extremely important to use any bit of efficiency that you possibly can. And as it turns out, these bacteria have become extremely sophisticated at developing quantum mechanical techniques. So in comes a photon. This is a particle of light, a photon. And the photon creates a nice little exciton. This process of hopping hither and thither through this complex is 99+% efficient. So in fact, the answer lies in what we in quantum computation call a quantum algorithm, a way of processing information in a coherent fashion.
You see, in the history of philosophy and poetry and art, we always find the interchange of two personality types, which I call Prickles and Goo. The prickly people are advocates of intellectual porcupinism. They want a rigor. They want precise statistics. And they have a certain clipped attitude in their voices, and you know this very well in academic circles, where there are people who are always edgy like that. And they accuse other people of being disgustingly vague and miasmic and mystical. But the vague, miasmic, and mystical people accuse the prickly people of being mere skeletons with no flesh on their bones. And they say to you, you just rattle. You're not really a human being. You know the words, but you don't know the music. If you are prickly, you're a classicist. And if you're gooey, you're a romanticist. And going back into medieval philosophy, if you're prickly, you're a nominalist. If you're gooey, you're a realist. But we know very well that this natural universe is neither prickles nor goo exclusively. It's gooey prickles and prickly goo. And you see, it all depends on your level of magnification. If you've got your magnification on something so that the focus is clear, you've got a prickly point of view. You've got structure, shape, clearly outlined, sharply defined. A little out of focus, it's going to go bleh, and you've got goo. But we're always playing with the two.
The idea of the observer in quantum mechanics is my friend JD. Shout out to JD. He's a physicist.
Cool.
He related to me that the real issue is in measuring it, and that when you measure it, that's the observer. It's not necessarily that you are looking at something or that human intention or visual, your visual cortex is tuned in on something.
No.
It's just the measuring. The act of measuring itself changes the results.
Yeah, because it's not like, we're not talking about big things. So like I could look at this water bottle and I could, make judgments about it. I could hold a ruler up next to it and make judgments about it. It's so large that the tools that I use to measure it don't interact with its intrinsic properties. But once you get down to things that are very, very small, and you could no longer use a microscope, for example, to see it, and you have to get down to more creative ways to measure it, all of a sudden the creative ways that you measure it actually process it as they measure it.
There's been so much malarkey that I've read and seen online about the idea of the observer changing the results, that I felt like, why did everybody have to turn into voodoo?
I did an interview with Brian Greene, who's a pretty renowned physicist. I asked him, how do you feel about it when people try to take what you understand about the quantum world and what you understand about the cosmos and apply it to like woo-woo pseudoscience and say, oh, but our thoughts are quantum. And so all of the people who are trying to shill quantum mechanics as an explanation for thought or behavior or love or any of these woo-woo things, none of them are fucking physicists.
Various great quantum physicists from time to time, in particular Eugene Wigner, actually proposed that somehow it was the conscious perceiver that is where the Schrödinger equation somehow breaks down. And I think von Neumann said a similar thing. So that if there wasn't somebody looking at it, then yes, the superpositions would continue. So I'm not saying that the role of consciousness is like that at all. I'm saying almost the opposite. There are all sorts of manifestations of consciousness which I'm not going to talk about. I'm not talking really about any of these things here. But I'm talking about the one thing that I can perhaps make some statement about of significance. That is the term understanding. And the question I want to raise here is a computer or computer-controlled robot capable of general understanding? One trouble with the word understanding is I don't know what it means. I've got three words here, intelligence and awareness. I don't want any of them mean, unfortunately. But you see, being a mathematician, I don't need to know what they mean. I can talk about relations between them. And I consider that whatever intelligence is, it's something which depends upon understanding. Likewise, I would say understanding in the usual sense of the word requires awareness. The proper understanding is a feature of consciousness. So if understanding can be shown to be beyond computation, then intelligence is not a matter of computation. And moreover, certain aspects of awareness, perhaps all, are beyond computation also.
The machines that we've built are designed to solve something called an optimization problem. And the optimization has many uses, but the one that we're focused on primarily is its use in the course of doing something called machine learning. So machine learning is a subfield of artificial intelligence that's concerned with the question of how do you take an engineered system, a machine, and allow it to learn from its environment. So this could be learning from video cameras, it could be learning from microphones, it could be learning from touch, it could be learning from all of those things at once. We know that humans do this quite effectively, but teaching a machine to learn in the way that humans do has turned out to be a very difficult problem. But recently there have been advances in the science of learning that allow us a path to try to actually replicate human-type learning in engineered systems. And somewhat fortuitously, the underlying mathematics of those methods can be run on our hardware.
In our January 2010 report, we aimed one loser arrow that might have missed its mark. Here are the first three paragraphs. D-Wave Systems, a Canadian startup, recently booted up a custom-built, multi-million-dollar liquid helium-cooled beast of a computer that it says runs on quantum mechanics. Now, building a practical quantum computer has proved hard. Really hard. Despite efforts by some of the world's top physicists and engineers and the likes of IBM, HP, and NEC, progress has been slow. Ask the experts and they'll tell you these systems are a decade or 5 away. Harsh words, and you can almost hear the gods of karma preparing their punishment. Sure enough, a couple of weeks ago, aerospace giant Lockheed Martin, maker of the F-22 Raptor fighter jet and the Mars Odyssey orbiter, bought a quantum computer from D-Wave for $10 million. So were we wrong to call D-Wave a loser? Are quantum computers really ready to make the leap from the laboratory to the commercial market? What is Lockheed Martin getting for its money that it can't get from a regular computer?
So D-Wave is a private company. It's been around for about 11 years. And we only do one thing, and that is build superconducting processors designed to embody a very specific quantum algorithm, which is this quantum annealing thing that Hartmut referred to earlier on.
Yeah, good afternoon, and thanks for coming to the third and final tech talk on quantum computing, where we are going to explore the question whether an explanation of higher brain function requires references to quantum mechanics. And essentially, what we would like to do is, in the last talks you saw how we mapped a human-type task, that is image recognition, pattern recognition, to a quantum chip, and how the information flow looked like and how we could deal with issues like preserving coherence among the qubits. So now we want to follow the natural idea, does this have any bearing on the functioning of the brain, and revisit the hypothesis that quantum effects are necessary to understand brain function. If you followed a little bit the DARPA competitions on autonomic vehicles, you can see that a task of, let's say, a stretch of I think nearly 100 miles to be done by an autonomic vehicle is something that's possible today, even though I would caveat that for a human, let's say, if think of a prehistoric human venturing off from the location of his village and then hunting some deer and then trying to come back, let's say, a stretch of 30 miles, just having his eyes, nose, ears, is a much harder task than what autonomous vehicles have to do today, since they have a GPS system, highly specialized sensors. So the task that's being solved there is not really on par with what humans do. So now you see where the explanatory gaps are. And whenever you have a shortfall in explanation, it's maybe time to review your theory. And the traditional entry door for quantum ideas into brain theory is to attempts to explain consciousness, mostly there, but also free will. John Searle was here at Google a couple of weeks ago and gave a talk on his ideas how quantum mechanics and free will might be connected. And it was also my goal to make a contribution to the age-old problem what consciousness might be, but then soon learned that it might be better and more prudent to go for a more modest goal. I try to argue that learning and creativity reaching meta levels, that these are those human abilities essentially need or can take advantage of quantum processes, and explaining this might be sort of a stretch on the way to explain consciousness.
So what problems are Lockheed Martin trying to solve here? What are they getting for their money that they can't get from a regular computer?
What our system does is solve optimization problems.
So optimization, you have an objective function and you want to find the minimum of this function. That's an optimization problem. And this was the picture from this morning. Here I have this video, and I apologize, several people here have seen this already many times, and I keep showing it again to give people who are not familiar with it the basic idea of a quantum resource that can help you better with finding the global minimum here. Classically, you could only have, this ball could have only rolled down and would have been stuck in a local minimum. If you have a second resource, tunneling, then of course if this barrier would have been too fat, the tunneling amplitude would have been very small and probably the advantage would have been tiny. But it's actually the beauty of the adiabatic quantum algorithm that it forms this landscape slowly. And hence, at any point in time, you have a good chance of having a reasonable tunneling amplitude. And overall, of course, physics determines what optimization problems you can solve. And bringing in this additional resource of quantum tunneling expands the reach quality of your optimization algorithms.
For example, you might want to know, what is the biggest financial return that I could get on any set of 100 financial instruments? And I have the freedom to choose any 100 I like, and maybe the freedom to choose the time scale and all this. So you can imagine that if I had to choose 100 financial instruments, there are lots of different combinatorial possibilities, many, 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 more than I could ever enumerate.
And so what we are doing on the application side is trying to understand the power of the state-of-the-art machine learning techniques when they're run in our systems in the service of building complete engineered systems that behave or mimic human-level intelligence. And not just intelligence in the sense of being able to do things faster, but mimicking human creativity, judgment, and so on. For the first time in history, I believe that the frameworks for understanding how to do this are in place, and our hardware is ideally suited to attacking one of the hard bottleneck problems that underlies this type of approach.
What about animal consciousness? Well, I've been talking about the poor cat. Well, it's only a thought cat, so I guess it's not so poor. But anyway, I was talking about the cat with a belief that that cat is conscious. And I certainly think that, and I believe it goes down. What about life generally? Well, that's more of a question here.
Let's suppose you have a system which is in a mixture of 0 and 1, and you would like to reset. That could be, for example, your memory, and you would like to reset that to state 0. And now we are talking about biology. Whatever small enzymes, molecules, and other systems are wiggling around in your biological systems, it could be that they are small enough to be a quantum observer. Now the interesting question is, how do you actually access that information? It's not enough to store it, you actually have to be able to read it out. How do you do that with these small systems?
And so what I'm about to show you is an accurate representation of the actual DNA replication machine that's occurring right now inside your body, at least 2002 biology. So DNA is entering the production line from the left-hand side, and it hits this collection, this miniature biochemical machines that are pulling apart the DNA strand and making an exact copy. So DNA comes in and hits this blue donut-shaped structure, and it's ripped apart into its two strands. One strand can be copied directly, and it can be seen spooling off down to the bottom there. But things aren't so simple for the other strand because it must be copied backwards. So it's thrown out repeatedly in these loops and copied one section at a time, creating two new DNA molecules. Now, you have billions of this machine right now whirring the right way inside you, copying your DNA with exquisite fidelity. It's an accurate representation, and it's pretty much at the correct speed for what is occurring inside you. But I've left out error correction and a bunch of other things. This was work from a number of years ago. Thank you.
All these nucleic acids, they are more or less planar molecules being surrounded by electron clouds. And you actually need the coherence between neighboring sites to get the attractive part of the force. But now this also has non-trivial implications. So first of all, neighboring sites are entangled due to this continuous interactions. So here was a screenshot from a computer program where you do something with DNA. You've seen it many times before. And to sum it all up, what I told you in the previous slides, everything that you can see on this picture is classical information. The black stuff and the double helix that you cannot see, that's a quantum information.
Which is a very peculiar thing. It's called a superposition state, where there's a probability of being in either of the two states, but it's not the kind of probability that you're thinking of. It's a probability of a sort where nature itself hasn't decided what the thing is. And so people use different types of words to describe this, but human language fails here, because no matter what words I use, they're only going to show you a facet of this wonderful jewel that is this effect.
So I haven't discovered any good way how to picture correlations. Probably there is no way, so that's why nobody ever draws quantum information.
There was this gathering, I think in 2011, fairly recently, of experts in quantum foundations, what quantum mechanics really means. And they took a poll. They had like 16 different questions to ask the experts, and one of them was simply, what is your favorite interpretation of quantum mechanics, or approach to thinking about what quantum mechanics really means? And the answers was that there wasn't even any one approach that got 50% of the vote. The results were all scattered across different possibilities. The traditional Copenhagen interpretation, where the quantum state collapses when you look at it, a more modern many worlds interpretation, where the universe splits into different possibilities, interpretations that add something new to quantum mechanics, like random stochastic changes of the wave function or hidden variables that we can't see. And I said it was extremely embarrassing to physics that here it is 80 years after we sort of established how quantum mechanics works, we still don't know what it really means.
If I'm going to explain this theory, the question is, are you going to understand it? Will you understand the theory? When I tell you first that the first time we really thoroughly explain it to our own physics students is when they're in the third year graduate physics, then you think the answer is going to be no. And that's correct. You will not understand. But this business about not understanding is a very serious one that we have between the scientists and an audience. And I want to work with you, because I want to tell you something. The students do not understand it either. And that's because the professor doesn't understand. Which is not a joke, but very interesting. But nobody knows what we do or how to define a series of steps which correspond to something abstract like thinking. But nevertheless, we could make machines which play chess, which are supposed to be something that takes thinking. And what exactly do they do? What definite procedure could you make with a big file system, very fast operating gadget, by which the thing could be used to play chess. What the machines do is just a tremendous amount of trying different positions. A human being doesn't. The human being tries about 35 positions as far as we can tell. When he's in a position, he tries about 35 looks at different moves before he makes a decision, whereas the machine makes something like 35 million positions to check. That doesn't make the machine better than the other guy. We don't understand how we do it. We cannot give a direct procedure for this. The man does it by recognizing a pattern. Oh, this knight can fork the king and queen or something, so if it goes here, so I have to watch out about that square. He sees patterns, at least he describes it that way. We really don't know how it works. But you can give a computer 50,000 numbers like that and ask for them in any reverse order, the sum of them, or do different things with them and so on, and it doesn't forget them for a long time, etc. So there are some things that a computer does much better than a human, and you'd better remember that if you kind of compare machines to humans. But what a human has to do for his own, they always do this, they always try to find one thing, darn it, that they can do better than the computer. So we now know many, many things that the humans can do better than the computer. She's walking down the street and she's got a certain kind of a wiggle, and you know that's Jane, right? Or the guy's going in and you see his hair flip just a little bit. It's hard to see, he's at a distance, but that particular funny way that the back of his head looks, that's Jack, okay? To recognize things, to recognize patterns, seems to be something that we have not been able to put into a definite procedure. You would say, I have a good procedure for recognizing Jack. Just take lots of pictures of Jack. By the way, a picture can be put into the computer. In fact, by this method here. If this were very much finer, I could tell whether it's black and white at different spots. You know, in fact, you get pictures in a newspaper by black and white dots. And if you just do it fine enough, you can't see the dots. So with enough information, I can load pictures in. So you put all the pictures of Jack under different circumstances and ask the machine to compare it. The trouble is that the actual new circumstance is different. The lighting is different, the distance is different, the tilt of the head is different, and you have to figure out how to allow for all that. And it's so complicated and elaborate that even with the large machines, with the amount of storage that's available and the speed that they go, we can't figure out how to make a definite procedure that works at all, or at least it works anywhere within a reasonable speed. So recognizing things is difficult for the machines at the present time, and some of those things are done in a snap by a person.
You, yes you, are better at recognizing spatial relationships than computer programs whose job it is to recognize spatial relationships. Congratulations! And you know who's even better than normal people at this stuff? Video gamers. There's this organization called Fold It that puts gamers to work figuring out how proteins fold up into their most stable and most useful states. But proteins are actually really extremely complicated structures. They're made up of long chains of amino acids, and for the most part, it's those amino acids that define what their shape is going to be. But proteins don't exist as long chains. As soon as they're formed, they fold up into themselves into mysterious shapes. They fold up for stability, but the way that they fold defines how they operate and what they do. And it's really tough to figure out how a protein is going to fold up. And so we spend a lot of money and time trying to figure this out. One, by having computers do it. Two, by actually trying to look at the protein while it's functioning to see if we can actually see its shape, which turns out is very hard to do. Because understanding how a protein folds up is a key to understanding how that protein works. And if it's a disease protein, it's a key to understanding how to stop that protein. So scientists have been developing computer programs for years that try and figure out how proteins fold up in their most stable states. But it turns out computers are just bad at that kind of stuff. And people are really good at it, especially people who have developed their spatial reasoning skills through hours and hours of video game playing. And so the organization Fold It figured out that the best solution to this problem was to turn protein folding into a video game.
When you've got it right, you see your protein moving and changing shape, and your score rushes up, your own player name rushes up through the ranks, and yeah, your adrenaline starts.
It's like being a scientist when you get a paper published. That 10% of euphoria is supposed to take you through the 90% of banging your head against a brick wall. But
So when I would like to fold a protein, I start with my DNA, which is a one-dimensional sequence of information. So in order to fully describe the classical information in DNA, I only need to know this one-dimensional sequence. In the next step, I translate pairs of 3 of my RNA into an amino acid. And then in the fourth step, this one-dimensional chain of amino acid actually folds into a 3-dimensional structure. But my question to the biologists is actually, where does this additional information come from? If you think about it in detail, that's actually not that trivial. Does it come from the time sequence in which you assemble the protein? Does it come from some sort of laws of quantum mechanics? Do you have some sort of quantum information actually also taking place? If anybody can tell me, I'd be very happy.
There's this AIDS-related enzyme that scientists have been trying to figure out the structure of for about a decade. When all the normal computational methods for unlocking the structure of the enzyme failed, they gave it to folded gamers to figure out. And it took them about 3 weeks to figure it out. Scientists have since been able to completely determine the structure of the protein, and they now think that they understand enough about it to actually start developing drugs to turn it off.
And when I was in high school, I ran across this guy who was building a company called Thinking Machines out of work that he'd done at m.i.t. And I've become fascinated with the whole subject, and he kind of kick-started my interest in this whole thing. More recently, in my professional life, I ran across Hartmut, who's a fascinating guy, and he has, asked a lot of interesting questions over the course of, my knowing him. But the thing that I'm going to talk about specifically is this idea that human cognition, all of our sensory input seems different. We've got vision, sound, and touch, and taste. But there's evidence, and I think fairly compelling evidence, that what we actually do under the hood may be driven by a single algorithm.
So what I wanted to do is talk for a moment about how wonderfully awesome and unbelievable it is that within a fraction of a second, this object could be recognized. Somehow, in a fraction of a second, your brain condensed all of that sea of information into a word that in some ways you can think of as a single bit. Of course it's not, but you can think of about the tiger light bulb in your head. It's a light bulb, it's got tiger written on it. It is either on or off. If there's a tiger in your field of vision, it's on, sort of like a bit. So how is this possible? It's not entirely clear, of course, because the biological systems are very complex. But what I'm going to do is segue from that to a very fascinating advance that's happened recently in computer science.
So a lot of the ideas that I'm going to be talking about now are motivated by this, that natural objects in the world are not random. If I were to show you a bunch of random images, none of this would work. But the things that we look at are not. They have a structure. Objects are contiguous and so on.
The world around us has a lot of structure in it. We don't tend to interact with things that are completely random. This technique that I've talked about doesn't work with random objects. If I were to take a completely random image, this will fail. It works somehow because the objects that we care about in video or pictures or text or whatever, they have structure in them, and it's somehow tied to the fact that we wrote them down at all. And in the tiger image, the reason why we're so good at detecting tigers is pretty obvious, because there's this giant thing with teeth and it's running at you, and if you can't say tiger within a fraction of a second, you're going to get eaten. How is it that a bacteria swimming in an ocean of information can make a determination in a fraction of a second that something's about to eat it? It somehow may be related to this fact that there actually isn't a lot of critically important information in that sea of information. And the bacteria can evolve sensors that only sample a very tiny fraction of what's going on around it and still make that call.
So here's a reconstruction of this little video. This is actually only a part of the video. I pulled out 8 images of a 256 image webcam stream. So now if I have 2 features, you notice something now that's a little bit more interesting. So you see these images over here that have the black bits at the top. now have black bits in the reconstruction. And the reason is that we now have a feature that has black at the top. So we have the option now of turning that on or off when we reconstruct the original video. And as you see, the reconstruction is still not very good. 4 gets a little bit better. Here's 20. That's a little bit better still. Here's 40. So with 40 basis images, that's these guys, I can with almost perfect reconstruction reconstruct this 256 image movie. So I tried to do this without doing any equations at all because I wanted to be conceptual, but that's not satisfying. So I'm just going to do a very brief. So when you try to solve for this optimization problem, you get this monumentally large number of. It's not so large that you can't do it, but it's so large that it stresses the capabilities of where we're at today in modern computing infrastructure. And you could probably do it a lot better if you had a faster discrete optimization solver, which is kind of like where it connects into the hardware that we're trying to build.
Okay, so the second thing I'm going to talk about is quantum computing. Quantum computers are just physics-based processors. They use the laws of physics at the very small scale to try to solve problems in an analog fashion. There's things like this around, which somewhat unfortunately are probably technically correct, but they're very misleading. David Deutsch loves to talk about parallel universes and things like this, and of course it's a double-edged sword, because when you're trying to build a real technology that acts in the real world, when you've got stuff like this floating around, it makes it seem like you might be biting off more than you can chew. On the other hand, there are some very wonderful and remarkable things about quantum mechanics as applied to computation. So these are some pictures of the types of machines that we build. At a high level, this is what it looks like. I'm actually connected to one right now on my laptop, so if the technology works, I can actually show you solving some problems on an actual system. This laptop is now connected in the form of being a remote user. So what we're doing is building this special purpose hardware that in an analog way exploits quantum mechanics to try to solve these things better. It's a so-called quantum annealing algorithm. So we took that thing, which in its raw form is about 280 megabits, we undersampled it to 80 kilobits, and then we reconstituted it using one of our chips. And so this is sort of what you see when you do it. You see perfect reconstitution of the image from something that's quite undersampled. It works quite well, so I'm very happy about this. It's funny, like when you actually build something that works and you still kind of don't understand really why it's working. I don't know if anybody's ever had this experience before. Usually when I build something and it works, I understand it perfectly well, but I'm still struggling with this a little bit.
You know, I used to think compression was kind of just this boring thing that you did with the JPEGs and stuff. It's not. Compression is really at the heart of a lot of the issues surrounding what it means to understand something. So the more that you can compress something, the more that you understand it, I think, is one way of thinking about this. So this idea of finding extremely sparse representations of the things that you like to classify is also a very important part of this. Things like anomaly detection. So you might imagine that these things learn to represent the images that they've seen. So one of the things you could do is show it images of chest x-rays of healthy people, and it will learn a basis set for reconstructing all of those images. If you now show it an image that isn't healthy, it has things in it that it hasn't seen. And what will happen is it will poorly reconstruct that aspect of the image, which is an anomaly, which is something that you're going to be looking for. It's something that's not like what I've shown it before. And anomaly detection is important across a whole bunch of different industries, including intelligence community, defense, and healthcare. But there's another way you can do it with this algorithm, which is the inverse problem. So instead of giving it an image and asking it for a label, give it a label and ask it for an image. Okay? So think about that for a second. So let me, instead of giving you all of the pixel data and asking you to fill in the labels, I'm going to give you the labels and ask you to fill in the pixel data. This guy is Douglas Hofstadter. He's a brilliant guy, and I very much admire his work. And one of his main threads that goes through his research is that creativity, in the sense of being able to generate things not using brute force prescriptions is a very key element to understanding cognition in humans. And this type of machinery allows you to generate things that have never been seen before in the world, like a new version of an apple, which is formed from these combinations of these dictionary atoms. That thing that it's generating has never been seen before, but it has the characteristic of apple.
Thought is fundamentally a function of brain activity. Like I'm a really hardcore materialist when it comes to that kind of stuff.
What is consciousness, though? That's what's really fascinating. It's like, what the fuck is that beautiful organ tuning in?
Then, of course, you think, well, how do our brains work? And there are all these neurons and things like that. And there are synapses. And these are pretty classical things because they really do decohere. I mean, you can't really, they disturb all the surrounding material. Stuart Hameroff, who was an anesthesiologist in the United States, and he wrote to me and said, it seems you don't know about these things, microtubules.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Hartmut and Google, for hosting us, and y'all for coming. The title of my talk is Clarifying the Tubular Bit Qubit, Defending the Penrose-Hameroff ORC-OR model of quantum computation in microtubules. Consider a single-cell paramecium, which can swim around, avoid obstacles, avoid predators, find food, learn. If you suck it into a capillary tube, it escapes. If you do it again, it escapes more quickly. It can find a mate, and it can have sex. This is actually a picture of two paramecium having sex. It's probably the only X-rated picture we'll see today. And it doesn't have any synapses. It doesn't have any nervous system per se. How does it do it? It uses structures called microtubules. And I often kid my AI friends they should worry about simulating a paramecium before worrying about a brain. So microtubules seem to be the nervous system of the cell. Now, the tau protein, which is thought previously just kind of hold the microtubule together, turns out that it does something more. It acts as a kind of a traffic signal for motor proteins, which transport synaptic materials.
So this is one of the biggest molecular structures that you have, at least as far as we've discovered so far, inside of us. So this is a single chromosome, and you have two strands of DNA in each chromosome. One is bundled up into one sausage, the other strand is bundled up into the other sausage. These things that look like whiskers that are sticking out from either side are the dynamic scaffolding of the cell. They're called microtubules, but the name's not so important. But what we're going to focus on is this red region. I've labeled it red here, and it's the interface between the dynamic scaffolding and the chromosomes. It is obviously central to the movement of the chromosomes, but we have no idea really, as to how it's achieving that movement. We've been studying this thing called the kinetochore for over 100 years with intense study, and we're still just beginning to discover what it's all about. And you'll see that there's one little last bit that's still remaining red, and it's walked away down the microtubules. That is the signal broadcasting system sending out the stop signal, and it's walked away. I mean, it's that mechanical. It's molecular clockwork. This is how you work at the molecular scale. So with a little bit of molecular eye candy, we've got kinesins, which are the orange ones. They're little molecular courier molecules walking one way. And here are the dynein. They're carrying that broadcasting system, and they've got their long legs so they can step around obstacles and so on. So again, this is all derived accurately from the science. The problem is we can't show it to you any other way.
And they often have to jump tracks and switch microtubules in the branching dendrite, and it's been a mystery how they seem to know where to go. It turns out that the tau at specific locations on the microtubule kind of traffic signals and tell particular proteins like this guy right here where to jump off. And so their placement is critical. Now, how do they know where to be? Is there are they that smart, or is there some kind of encoding in the microtubule itself? And we know that when we open our eyes, the world appears before us. And we know that light enters the eyes, goes to the thalamus and the back of the brain, and then bing, the world appears before us. Now, the word bing has kind of come into use in the consciousness studies area to denote phenomenal subjective experience, otherwise known as the hard problem, what it is like to be something. So if you see bing, that means conscious phenomenal experience, and that's what we're trying to understand. The quantum interactions, say, in this neuron can spread by tunneling to the next neuron, the next neuron, the next neuron, and perhaps through the whole brain by these gap junction-mediated hyperneurons. Okay, well, where's the bing? Roger Penrose came up with the idea that consciousness is linked to quantum gravity that is fundamental space-time geometry. And when he first came up with this in 1989, it was like he was from another universe or something. What the hell was he talking about? And at this point, I had been working on microtubule information processing for 20 years, and people kept saying, essentially, well, where's the Bing? How does that explain consciousness? So I read his book, and I thought he had some very interesting ideas. He basically said that quantum superpositions, which avoid decoherence, grow to meet threshold given by the indeterminacy principle, undergoes spontaneous self-collapse, objective reduction, a fundamental moment of consciousness, and the consciousness is a sequence of these types of quantum state reductions. This is very much like Alfred North Whitehead's occasions of experience, and Henry Stapp has a somewhat comparable idea.
So what we see is acts on a spatiotemporal large scales are being folded back to very small scale and very archaic structures. And what I have a hard time believing is that sort of the Russian puppet just stops at the single neuron level. That there's a hard ceiling that information processing below does not matter. This is not, when we study nature and how information flows are organized, it doesn't seem to look this way. So these were the general arguments. Let's move to more specific, I would like to call them building blocks, processes of the style we could use to build the quantum box system. So first, I would like to point out that it's well understood that our eyes, the retina, is so sensitive that it can faithfully signal the absorption of a single photon, a single light quant. Numerous papers show this. So this would be for the decoding very useful. Now in the quantum box, once a solution has been found, I think reading it out, obviously we have neurons that are sensitive enough to do that. Another set of work, very recent work, Mausgro et al., shows that to understand enzyme function, quantum mechanical effects, in particular quantum tunneling, is a key process. Again, enzymes, you probably know, is sort of a biocatalyst which takes sort of a substrate and causes a chemical reaction to happen, or facilitates a chemical reaction. And a last piece that I find quite amazing is that it has now been found that, and again, this is no new age type of literature, this is American Journal of Chemistry, a well peer-reviewed journal, that the antioxidant activity of green tea is due to a tunneling effect. And it has long been a question how catechols, the key ingredient in green tea, can be so effective. It's actually the same story like with the enzymes. Here it's shown to do the antioxidant effect, you essentially have to affect the reaction. And there's an energy hump you have to overcome with typical chemical reaction setup. And again, you have basically two ways to go. Classically, you go over the hump. That's the only way to go. In quantum mechanics, you can also go through the hump via tunneling.
But that's what biological systems do. They order molecules, right? They put them in interesting.
And that is why I would like to see them in the outer segments of photoreceptor cells, where you not only have ordered molecules, but you have ordered membranes that are beautifully stacked, hundreds and thousands of them. And so that would be a logical place for something like that to take place.
How do you see, Paul, the idea that this phenomenon that we're talking about of these birds is an example of evolution capturing a quantum phenomenon and using it for some sort of competitive advantage in the environment?
Right, so it leads inevitably to the question, well, if birds can do it, why can't people do it? In fact, I used to work with a man who claimed he could detect magnetic north when blindfolded. I never did any experiments, but I suppose it's not inconceivable that it's pervasive throughout biology. I don't know, but I suspect it is just restricted to birds. So this is what we'd like to know. Is it just here and there? There's a little bit of quantum trickery that is going to give the organism the evolutionary edge, or is there something much more pervasive? And the problem is, it comes right down to this word that we always run into, complexity. Biological organisms are incredibly complex. Now, the way you've been presenting this is that quantum mechanics is really hard to understand, deeply mysterious and so on, but life is something very familiar. But for us, it's around the other way. We understand quantum mechanics, that's no problem, but we don't understand life. Because life is so incredibly complex. Life, to a physicist, life looks just like magic. It really does. It's really hard to understand what's going on. And so the thing is that if quantum mechanics is playing a really deep role in life, it's obscured because of that complexity. If you just take something, there's one particular molecule that I like, the polymerase motor. So this is the molecule that is relatively small, biologically speaking, but still a huge number of atoms, impossible for a theoretical physicist to describe, bolts itself onto the DNA, the unzipped DNA, and it sort of rivets all the base pairs. So it's sucking in the nucleotides and then making all the right rivets. And it chugs along at about 100 base pairs a second. It's like a little motor. And it turns out if you tension the DNA, it slows down and then can actually go into reverse. So here's something you think an engineer or physicist could wrap his or her head around, because it's a, it's a little machine that's doing a job with well-defined properties in terms of speed and so on.
So you look at DNA and you go, magic, but then you see it like building and you go, I saw that happening in downtown when they were building the World Trade Center.
So the question we'd like to know is,
an engineering
is this all about just ball and stick stuff, too complicated, or is there some quantum goings-on inside this little motor? Well, how can we tell? It is so incredibly complex. But it could well be that such fundamental processes as DNA replication, or even DNA information processing, though that's a bit more of a stretch, might be fundamentally quantum mechanical. And that would be a whole new level. Then quantum biology would really take off. We can't get at it at the moment because of this stupendous complexity.
But in general, when you're looking at processes that are molecular, even though they're life-based, are orderly and have to rely on well-known physical and chemical properties of atoms to maintain the orderliness of either the assembly or the disassembly of whatever process you're talking about, that's a candidate for looking at quantum phenomena.
Right, I mean the dependability of nature, so that the fact that we have molecules with shapes and so on like that is also quantum mechanical. But what we'd like to know is whether things like the tunneling or the entanglement are playing a role as well. And I'm sure they are playing, it's more than just the examples we've done. There must be other examples. But what Schrödinger and company really wanted was that quantum mechanics somehow would be the essence of life. That, like the weird aspects of life would be fundamentally quantum in their nature. So that one day we will finally, through quantum mechanics, say, oh, now we know why life does all this sort of magical stuff. We're a long way from that, and it may be that that's simply misconceived.
Although that refers, as close to anything as we've said tonight, to some of the kind of folksy anxieties and notions of quirkiness that exist sort of in everyday psychological and biological life. You're suggesting that Schrödinger and Wigner and that gang, that part of their temperance about being perhaps initially repelled by quantum mechanics what was almost a humanistic impulse to say, this is weird, what else do I know that's weird? Well, life is weird.
Right.
And they saw a unity there almost immediately back in the 1930s.
Life is clearly a distinctive state of matter. We don't know of anything else like it. We separate the living world from the non-living world. Now, there's got to be some transition between the two because life began somehow. We don't know how. Maybe quantum mechanics played a role there. But it is very, very distinctive in its properties. And so we would like to know, is that distinctiveness fundamentally quantum mechanical, or is it just the complexity?
All right, we'll talk
and I'd love to say it's quantum mechanical. I'm not going to hold my hand on my heart and say it is. But a little part of my mind is open to the fact that one day we may understand it. And it may even be that we need to extend quantum mechanics, because I think Schrödinger and his colleagues felt that quantum mechanics wasn't the final theory of matter, that there would be some post-quantum mechanics that would replace it, that would explain life and maybe even consciousness, but let's not go there. The difficulty with all of these explanations is that you can't separate these the things we are interested in, a particular molecule, from its environment. It's it's embedded in its complex environment with all sorts of interactions going on, and we come right back to this problem of the complexity of life. That quantum mechanics deals best with simple things like electrons and photons and atoms and so on. And as you start getting more and more complex and start embedding things in a more and more complex environment, it's really hard to tease out the specific quantum properties of individual things. So you can pluck them out, and then you can experiment with them in isolation in the lab, but that's not the reality.
When we crack open, cells and pull out mitochondria, what happens? Mitochondria normally are present in filaments, but when we snap them apart, pull them out of the cell, they snap into like little spheres, according to soap bubble physics. So you lose their normal configuration when you crack open the cell as well. And what we've learned is that actually dramatically influences their function. Their function when they're in long filaments and networks within a cell are very different from when they're just in little balls. And we are always measuring just the function in little balls, okay?
This is the real bugbear of doing biology, that you have to look at it holistically. It's a system.
So annoying.
And it's always hard to know, cause and effect. It's hard to know what you can ignore and what you can rule out. Physics has made such incredible progress in the last 300 years because physicists are very good at knowing what to ignore. That ultimately we can say something sensible about the world without knowing everything about it. We can separate out little bits of the world and experiment with it. And that's why physics has been so good.
So what Lockheed wants to do with this particular system is see if we can recast a particular type of problem, which is called verification and validation, in optimization language, and then use our systems to make inroads into this problem. So verification and validation is, given a big complex system, of which there are many nowadays, and the aerospace industry is rife with them, large machines that have many, many parts, lots of different software of a variety of different types from different vendors, lots of different very complex hardware pieces. They all have to work together, and they can't fail for unintended reasons. They can't have behavior that wasn't in the spec.
My name is Jordy Rose. I'm the Chief Technology Officer and one of the founders of D-Wave Systems.
My name is Michael Hayden. I'm the Director of the Center for Molecular Medicine and Therapeutics and a Killam Professor in Medical Genetics at UBC.
So I have a little bit of a futurist bent. I like to think about things that might become true that aren't incompatible with the laws of physics. And there are a large number of possibilities of really grand challenge problems that might break during our lifetimes. And I find that extremely exciting.
The exciting part for us right now is we're in our golden age. We have the ability through other advances in technology to know our whole human genome sequence. 3 billion little letters of our alphabet. We understand, and this has made us both human, unique, and linked. Our DNA alphabet has linked us to everybody on mankind.
So things like the development of truly intelligent machines, which is something that I've been thinking about quite a lot over the last few years, given the work that I do. But there are also things that are more biological in nature that touch on this, which is questions about what it means to be human.
The challenges are in how to incorporate this information, how to interpret it, how to predict, and this is where we need your help in terms of how to predict the changes in structure, what's deleterious, what's not, and also what we desperately need of our translators, people who can act between the science and the person in the community and to translate this information. We have to make sure this information is not lost in translation.
We sit in these physical bodies, where for a physicist these are collections of bits that store the states of the variety of things that we hold dear. All of our emotions and dreams somehow resolve down to the states of memory registers somewhere in our consciousness or in our brains and our bodies. It's intriguing to me the possibility that you might be able to replicate that in a different substrate.
This is leading, and the advances in technology is leading to a whole rewriting of medicine. We used to think about cancer as one disease. We now know that breast cancer is 25 diseases, not so much defined by what you see under a microscope, but rather what you see by the letters of changes of DNA and RNA expressed in different ways at different types of disease. And the exciting part of that is that this leads to approaches to therapy. We're now beginning to understand why it is that some people respond well to a drug and other people don't, and yet the cancer looks the same. It's a certain cancer. Or why certain people have certain genetic traits that lead them to have an adverse event to a drug. And we're beginning to understand that.
So these things 10 years ago, maybe even to a certain extent today, sound like that they might be the realm of strange science fiction, but I don't think they are anymore. So as we learn more and more about the science of biological systems. I think that the mysteries start to become not exactly stripped away, but much more precise. So you can put your fingers on exactly what's happening in all of these different things. The more we understand about that, the more we'll be able to affect it and remove things like disease, and ultimately things that are even at a meta level from disease, things like aging, and then ultimately maybe conquer those things at some point.